Hey y'all, this is Brown at I Have Brown, and tonight we're going to be talking about the movie The Park Is Mine on Blu-ray. So this movie came out in 1985 and was directed by Stephen Hilliard Stern with a screenplay by Lyle Gorge, which was in turn based on a novel by Stephen Peters. So this particular movie is oftentimes regarded as something of a ripoff of the classic Stallone movie First Blood. And this is a description that's appropriate because it is a ripoff of First Blood, but at the same time, there's enough originality to it to where, while one can acknowledge that, yeah, it's definitely taking a lot from First Blood. We can at the very least appreciate that some of its strengths and some of the more positive aspects of the movie make it worth watching. And amongst other things, you have a rather good central performance by Tommy Lee Jones as the troubled protagonist, and you also have a rather good score by Tangerine Dream, the same group that gave us the classic scores for movies like Sorcerer, Legend, and Near Dark. And so this particular movie also happens to have the distinction of being the first thing to come out of the company HBO. And so HBO, of course, is the cable company that gave us hit shows like The Sopranos and Game of Thrones. So there's that little tidbit there. But the fact that this movie came out around the time wherein around the time of the 80s, where the plight of returning, veterans, people who had fought in wars and were coming home, there was a rather sad plight to, these people, because especially with, say, veterans returning from the Vietnam War, they were oftentimes mistreated by the government that sent them to the war in the first place. There were programs, but at the same time, not a lot of these programs were as helpful as the veterans were needing, and they would oftentimes have trouble adjusting or readjusting to being back in the world. And they would come back with a lot of problems. Like, even if, say, all their limbs were intact, they'd come away with, mental scars and what have you. And so the Vietnam War really screwed up a lot of people. Yes, I know on both sides, but since we're talking about, an American, protagonist, there's more of a focus on, say, the plight of American, soldiers having, returned from the Vietnam War. But this is a movie that I'm not going to say it's a straight up good movie, but at the same time, it is a solid one. And it's something where, as much as it rips off First Blood, and, and despite the fact that there are some flaws with this movie, there are enough positives in here to make it worth watching. And say, for example, if you're a fan of movies like, say, First Blood or Uncommon Valor, this movie is definitely worth checking out. And how I came across it, I just happened to find a clip from the movie online, and it was a fascinating clip, and it kind of made me want to know what the rest of the story was. And a little bit after that, I heard the score I listened to a score from the movie because I saw that Tangerine Dream did the score. I'm like, hey, I like these guys. And so those two things definitely got me interested in the movie. And so a while back, I was able to get this at Movie Trading Company, and the rest is history. And so having seen this, I definitely have a soft spot for it. I can recognize that, it's not a masterpiece by any means, but at the same time, the sincerity wherein they try to, deliver a message about, the plight of, Vietnam veterans and how, they deserve better treatment by the government and the public. Especially at this point in time that the movie was made, the sincerity does manage to shine through. And a lot of that has to do with, Tommy Lee Jones's good performance as the protagonist. So let's get into it. What the story is. So the movie focuses on a character by the name of Mitch, who was played by Tommy Lee Jones. And Mitch was a former U.S. Army soldier who fought in Vietnam, and he came back, but he came back, mentally and emotionally scarred, to the point where, he had a lot of time. He had a rather difficult time readjusting to being a civilian again, and trying to have something of an ordinary life. But unfortunately, though, he has a difficult time holding down a job. He's had enough of a conflict with, say, his wife, to a point where the two of them are now divorced, and he's like several months behind on child support. And so he's not able to see his son, because, well, he can't pay child support because he doesn't have a job. And at one point he actually did have a job, but apparently his coworkers kept on ribbing him, and considering that he wasn't in the best state of mind, he just couldn't handle it, and so he left. And so basically being a civilian at this point is something that's more than a little difficult for him. But things take a rather interesting turn in his life, wherein he gets a letter from a friend of his, and said friend was a former was a fellow Vietnam veteran, who that had fought and served with him during the war. And this guy, it turns out, had actually gotten cancer, and he may have gotten it from some of the stuff that was going around in Vietnam, like Agent Orange or something like that. But the point is, he found out he had cancer. I mean, there wasn't really much that the government was doing to try and help him, or there wasn't much that anyone was doing in the way of trying to help him. And so, I mean, he tried to implement this plan wherein he had stockpiled a lot of weaponry that he had gotten from the war, like various assault rifles and landmines, as well as barbed wire. And what he was wanting to do was take over Central Park, because this is in New York, takes place in New York City. But he's wanting to basically take control of Central Park, and keep anyone from getting in, and basically hold the park until Veterans Day, and basically draw attention to the plight of those who fought in the Vietnam War, and how they're being screwed over by their own government, and maybe get the public to think about what these people are going through. But unfortunately, though, the cancer took too much of a toll on him, to where he was able to stockpile all this stuff, and he was able to draw a map as to where he was wanting to put certain traps and everything, but he wasn't able to physically implement the plan. And he was basically in hospice, and that's how bad the cancer was. And he had committed suicide. But prior to committing suicide, he sent this letter to Mitch saying, hey, this is what I'm wanting to do, but I don't think I'm going to be able to carry it out. And if I die, before you get this letter, then I need you to carry out the mission, and do this for me, old friend, that kind of thing. And so this is where Mitch basically has a renewed purpose in life, because one, I mean, he's wanting to honor the final request of his deceased comrade and friend, and he also is basically one of these people that his friend is talking about. I mean, he's feels that he's been screwed over by the government, and the government hasn't really done much to help him, and neither has anyone else really. And so he uses his he's able to find the storage facility where his friend had stockpiled all this weaponry. And so once he sees that this is for real, he's like, okay, I'm in. And so he starts to survey the area and find the best routes of entry and exit, and he gets to where he's able to by himself block off the park over a period of time, and overnight he has the park to himself. But prior to that, he had caused some structural damage to a police station. I mean, he made a point to not kill anyone because, per the wishes of his friend, his friend had, basically wanted to make a point to, not actually hurt or kill anyone if it could be helped, but at the same time, say that, hey, I'm willing to cause some damage if I have to, but I don't want to. And so Mitch, he does some structural damage to a police station. He blows up, part of a building and a couple of cars, but he makes a point to do so, in such a way to where the police have time to evacuate and what have you. And so after he does that, he calls, the media and tells them that, hey, I'm the guy who attacked the police station, and I'm taking control of Central Park, and no one is to come in. And I have it, I have traps all over the place. I have, mines and barbed wire and what have you. And I am heavily armed. But he's basically explaining that, I just want this park for, such and such amount of time until Veterans Day. And on Veterans Day, I will turn myself in. But until that time, no one is to come into the park. If anyone does try to, I will defend myself. But he's basically also, saying that, he's just a guy who's, tired of being pushed around by, the world, and, he's tired of being screwed over, by, his own government. And so, he's just wanting to, make a point to say that, hey, I'm not the only one who's going through this, and a lot of us have suffered because of the government and what they've done to us. And so so I just want I just want people to think about things. I just want the public to acknowledge us. I want the public to understand that a lot of people have been hurt over this and are still being hurt over this. And so this ends up causing a bit of a division amongst the authorities, because, I mean, you have this one police I believe he was a captain, a guy by the name of Eubanks, as played by Yapikoto, who is somewhat sympathetic to him in the sense that, he understands that, people who, fought in Vietnam, and came back, didn't have the best time of readjusting to things and being a civilian again. And so, he's trying to say, okay, why don't we just, let the guy, hold the park, until Veterans Day, and just take him in, once that time limit's up. And so, some of the people and the authorities are kind of like, I mean, yeah, that sounds like a reasonable plan, but at the same time, do we know that this guy's going to keep his word? And so it kind of goes back and forth. And then you have members of the authorities, like, people in the government, who are kind of like, who does this guy think he is? I mean, who is he? What's he doing, showing us up? I mean, this is a national landmark. I mean, who does he think he is, taking it over? And surely it's not just one guy. Surely it's just a group of people. And so they're thinking that it's a terrorist thing. And so they insist on, sending, SWAT teams into the park, to try and, flush these, supposed terrorists out. But, of course, they find out the hard way that, I mean, Mitch was not joking around. I mean, the place has booby traps, and Mitch is prepared to defend himself. And so, like, while he doesn't set out to kill anyone, I mean, he doesn't just, sit back and let the authorities come in to take him. And so the authorities, like the SWAT teams, are ultimately driven off, and Mitch ends up having the park to himself, and he can't believe that. I mean, it's actually happening. And then things get a little complicated, though, when a reporter named Valerie, as played by Helen Shaver, sneaks her way into the park and finds Mitch, or actually Mitch finds her. And initially, I mean, he's all like, what the hell are you doing here? And he's about to, you kind of get the idea that, I mean, while he's not wanting to kill her necessarily, I mean, he's not above causing her harm. But she explains her that, hey, she's just wanting to get a story for, her news station. And while, yes, there is some self-interest on her part, she's thinking that, hey, maybe, if I can, record you, and get your statements to the public, then, maybe your message, what you're trying to say, can reach a broader audience. And maybe, it'll go beyond, what the government will allow the public to hear. And so Mitch, eventually agrees to this. And so, he allows her to basically tag along with him, and because of the fact that she's, recording him, like he's able to, broadcast his thoughts and, in his issues, his grievances, and what have you. And a lot of his stuff is connecting with a good amount of the, public. And so you got people, forming protest rallies at this point, protesting, the government's, mistreatment of, Vietnam veterans and what have you, as well as, the government's, lack of care for those who aren't, say, financially well off, because that's one of his other concerns, and that's one of the other things that he addresses is, basically, if you can't afford to pay your bills, then, you're literally thrown out in the cold, that kind of thing. And so, so while this is going on, the government, they just insist on escalating things, and to a point where, when the SWAT teams don't work, they send in like a helicopter or two, and then they get to where they send in a couple of mercenaries who had also fought in the Vietnam War. And so, so basically, the government, while they're saying that, oh yeah, we just want to, flush this guy out, we just want to bring him in, they actually want to kill him because they can't stand being upstaged or made fools of, by, just one guy, and so, so yeah, that's the, basic gist of the movie. And okay, so I like this movie. I think that, in some respects, I mean, there are definitely some powerful moments, but there are also some things about this movie that I felt like could have been handled better. And I feel like if they had been handled better, this would actually be a straight up good movie as opposed to just a solid one. But, first things first, Tommy Lee Jones does a very good job in this movie. And, he does a good job of, say, playing an individual who, you could tell has, some form of, mental trauma or emotional trauma in the way he interacts with the, those around him. But then when he goes into, say, soldier mode, like when he's, setting up the traps and everything, and, he's going about his mission of taking over Central Park, I mean, he's able to, bring this intensity to the role, to a point where you definitely buy the fact that, Mitch is someone who was lost in the civilian world, but once he's given, say, a war, mission again, like he's able to, come to life and, have a purpose. And, Tommy Lee Jones does a very good job of capturing that. And also liked how, you had moments where he sort of he kind of went back and forth between, say, being emotionally troubled, but ultimately, level-headed and aware of what he was doing. And then there'd be a moment or two where it seemed like he was on the verge of snapping, like of going insane in some way, but thankfully, he doesn't. But, the danger is there. And then you'd have moments where, he sort of has like a moment of clarity, wherein he realizes, that, hey, this is something that is actually happening, and people are actually paying attention, but I can't just, go back to, who I once was once this is all over, because, now everyone knows who I am, and, I'm going to be arrested. I'm going to complete the mission though, but there's no going back. And so like he has a moment of clarity like that. And, it's very well done in a sense of, showing these, conflicting emotions as far as how Tommy Lee Jones, plays his character. And Helen Shaver, she does a good job as the reporter Valerie. And, and it's interesting how they, had her character, because, initially, she does really come across as, someone who's only in this for herself. Like she comes across as, what you see of a lot of reporters in a lot of movies where, they're, trying to land that big scoop to launch them into the big time. And like, they initially don't really care about, say, the players in the story. They just, want, the prestige, of capturing the story. But somewhere along the way, though, Valerie, while she does become kind of a hostage for Mitch, not mistreated, mind you, for the most part. He's a little rough with her at first, but that's mainly because he was not, expecting there to be, someone, say, from the media trying to, get a hold of him, in person while he's, while he's holding the park, like he was ready for, say, SWAT teams or National Guard or something like that, but he wasn't ready for, say, someone from the media. And so that's why he's initially like, intense and, on edge with her. But then somewhere along the way, though, the two of them strike up a rapport, and, he starts to open up to her about some things, and she actually starts to, look past, her own agenda, and starts to say like, okay, this guy's probably a bit unhinged here, but he does have a point about things. And so, she actually, finds herself sympathizing with him in some ways, and while at the same time trying to actually land the scoop, a good, story that'll solidify her career. So very interesting how Helen Shaver played the part. And then, of course, you have the late, great Yaphet Kotto as Eubanks, the probably one of the few, figures of authority who is level-headed enough to try and find, a peaceful solution, or as peaceful as of a solution as there can be in the situation, because, he's, aware enough of, say, Mitch's skill set, once he gets a glimpse of, the tactics that the guy's using, but at the same time, though, he gets the feeling that, Mitch is, or whoever this person is, because he doesn't know, the guy's name yet, but whoever's, trying to take control of Central Park, they have a mission, they have an agenda, but it's not one of chaos. Like, they're just trying to make a point, and so and I liked how, Yaphet Kotto played Eubanks, because in the sense that he's trying to do his job and keep the public safe, but in this case, keeping the public safe might mean, well, letting this quote-unquote terrorist, have his way. But if that means, no loss of life, then okay, that might be the best, solution for the situation. And so, but then on the other hand, he's having to butt heads with, all these government bureaucrats, who can't stand the fact that, you know, one person or a group of persons are, making them look like idiots, by, broadcasting, a lot of the bullshit that they've done, to the public and what have you. And so he's having to go up against all that. And so he basically comes across as like a beleaguered bureaucrat, but a genuine good guy, though. And so, I mean, Yapakoto, does a very good job in the part. And you kind of feel some sympathy for his character simply because, he's someone who's, trying to do, what is, probably the closest thing to the right thing in a sense of, say, on one hand, letting this guy, have his moment or saying his piece, but at the same time, trying to make sure that, there's no danger to the public, but unfortunately, though, he's ultimately not in charge of the situation. And so I kind of got like a Die Hard vibe in a sense of, say, Reginald VelJohnson's character from Die Hard, being, one of the few level-headed characters that, John McClane's able to, communicate with, like in that movie, except, this came out before Die Hard, so a little bit there. But yeah, like those three actors in particular, I thought, did a really good job as, say, like the central characters. And you have, the actors like Lawrence Dane and Peter Davarsky playing some of the more corrupt or, I guess, yeah, basically, corrupt members of, say, parties of the government, who are throwing their weight around. And, they did a good job in the parts they had. But I felt like that they came across as kind of cartoonishly evil at times, as opposed to, say, cool, level-headed evil that you'd probably expect more to find in, say, personnel of the government, because, usually you see them portrayed as, people who are, absolutely heartless, as opposed to, say, mustache twirling villains, whereas in this movie they kind of come across as mustache twirling villains. They do a good job playing mustache twirling villains, but at the same time, they just come across as, incompetent villains because they keep on escalating things and Mitch keeps on outwitting them, that kind of thing. And so, yeah, then that leads into, a couple of the issues I had with the movie. Because on one hand, it's not outside of the realm of possibility for, one well-trained individual, to hold an area like, say, Central Park. If they're skilled in military tactics and they have the equipment, and they have the know-how, one person could conceivably do something like that. And potentially, defend themselves from, say, authorities, or figures of authority, such as, say, like, SWAT teams or National Guard or something like that. So one person could conceivably do that. It wasn't that long ago that there was, I believe he was like a former military guy who, he went crazy or something, and held this building, to a point where the authorities couldn't get to him, and he was just taking pot shots at everyone, and they ultimately ended up sending in something to blow him up. And so one guy could do something like that. I'm not trying to say I was pulling for that crazy sniper guy in real life. I'm just trying to make a point that it is possible for someone who's skilled in military tactics and has training like that to do something like that. So in that respect, I thought that that was pretty cool to see in this movie, like one well-trained person being able to pull something off like this. And I do like how you have moments where Mitch's character, as portrayed by Tommy Lee Jones, has these moments where he's like, my God, I actually did it. And like there's even this moment where he's, you know, it's like in the morning or something, and the sun's coming out, and he sees that he's literally got the park to himself, and he's like, it worked. Like, he wasn't thinking it was going to work, but it did. And so you have these moments where you can kind of relate to his feelings of surprise and triumph as well. But so if there's a problem I have with Mitch, though, it's not with, say, how he's depicted in terms of, say, being skilled in military tactics, and it's certainly not in the way that Tommy Lee Jones portrays him, because Tommy Lee Jones does a very good job with the character. But there are moments, where, say, like the writing or directing, could have been done much better for his character, especially towards the beginning, leading up to him taking over Central Park, because we get the idea that, yes, he's emotionally and psychologically damaged, from his time in Vietnam. And yeah, he has a hard time holding down a job, and he doesn't react well when people, make fun of him or something like that. But the way it's shown in the movie, though, like when he tries to go see his ex-wife and, see his son, and she's all like, well, you haven't paid child support in X amount of months. I mean, you can't just come around here acting like everything's A-okay. And then she even asks him, like, I thought, didn't you have a job? I mean, didn't you get a job just, a couple of weeks ago? And, the reason he gives for leaving the job is basically saying that, oh, they kept on calling me the Okie from Muskogee. And when you hear that in the movie, I mean, for me personally, I'm just kind of like, really? I mean, I understand that you've been through some shit, but you left just because, some, douchebags at work called you Okie from Muskogee? I mean, because it's one of those things where I guess it depends on, your own life experience, but at some point, you've got to be able to, have a thicker skin than that. I mean, because, you can't just fly off the handle every time someone, says something, to you. And so I understand that Mitch's character was emotionally damaged, but the thing is, just, from what we see, though, from the way things are written, it literally sounds like he just left, his job because some of his, fellow coworkers called him Okie from Muskogee, and that doesn't really sound like, a relatable or valid reason to just quit your job, especially when you need a job, that kind of thing. So I think that if they had maybe shown him, say, in this day-to-day life trying to function or something like that, and maybe have a scene or two where he's at work and, trying to do, what he's assigned to, but he's just, lost when it comes to, say, interacting with his coworkers, and then his coworkers bullying him or something like that, and it maybe have it to where it's implied that this goes on a regular basis, and he has a hard time, say, trying to reach out to, say, like a supervisor or something like that, say, hey, these guys keep on bothering me, can you do something about it, or that kind of thing. I mean, if they had shown stuff like that, say, giving us, a definite portrayal of, say, just how bad off he is in terms of, say, interacting with the world, or just, how difficult it is for him to, hold down a job if he can't, say, bring himself to defend himself against, just, workplace idiocy, So I just think that if we had seen him in more of his day-to-day life, just trying to function, I think that maybe when we got to that point where he's basically saying they called me the Okie from Muskogee, I mean, we might have, been more on his side because we would have seen what it was like for him. But because of how it's done in the movie, though, it just really comes across as, someone who threw a temper tantrum, that kind of thing. And I hate to say it because, I mean, I like Tommy Lee Jones, and, I like his character in this movie. I just think that poor aspect of his character could have been handled better. Yeah, so that's something that I kind of took issue with because, I mean, you look at the movie First Blood, and you see, exactly how John Rambo, gets to the point where he ends up going crazy and declaring all-out war on, the police station in that movie. I mean, you see how basically he was minding his own business, but because he looked like a vagrant, he was harassed and what have you, and disrespected. And all that stuff just added up and added up. And then when it got to where they were physically manhandling him, he ended up snapping, right? So the point I'm trying to make is, First Blood, worked wonderfully because we saw him going from point A to point B. And so, the violent outcome made sense. Whereas here, though, I mean, you can kind of look for hidden meanings and what have you, but simply put, at the end of the day, they don't really do a good job of showing him going from point A to point B. It's just, it's hinted at how what's going on in his life, but because we don't see exactly, how he got from point A to point B, I mean, it's kind of murky in the sense of, say, him going from, quitting his job because they call him Okie from Muskogee to, suddenly being all in on, this, final mission, from his, dead friend, So that was an area I thought could have been handled better. And so the other thing is, okay, so one of the things that kind of, kept me, thinking like, well, wait a sec. I mean, this is ridiculous. I mean, not the movie, mind you, but certain aspects of the movie are ridiculous in the sense of, say, how, the authorities keep on escalating things, and, they come across as, almost cartoonishly inept at times. And in a way, it's kind of cathartic because, I mean, let's just face it. I mean, the government, and the authorities in general, at the end of the day, have done some really lousy things, to, various people, And I mean, like, shoot, I mean, look at some of the stuff the ATF has done. And, I mean, and so, there is a certain level of, catharsis when we see Mitch's character coming out on top of, against these guys. And there is some First Blood level of mayhem, like, say, in terms of like booby traps and what have you, but it's not quite as, gruesome as, say, some of the stuff that you saw in First Blood, but it's enough to where you're like, yeah, I mean, Mitch is definitely kicking these guys' asses, and so, like, it's cathartic in that respect, but at the same time, just the fact that they kept on piling on and, falling all over themselves just to try and get this one guy, I mean, it just really came across as like, I mean, we're rooting for Mitch in that regard, but at the same time, it's like they really come across as cartoonishly inept, because of how they keep on screwing things up, and then of course they cross the line of more morality altogether, wherein they bring in some straight up cold-blooded mercenaries to try and kill Mitch, when they can't do the jobs themselves. And so it's one of those, I guess, in some respects it works, but in other respects it doesn't, because, like, we're rooting for Mitch, but it's hard to take the villains seriously simply because of how inept they are and how, mustache twirling evil they are. But then again, I mean, it's like, like I was saying about how, it is possible for one person who is skilled in military tactics to pull off something similar to what Mitch did in the movie. I mean, it's not outside the realm of possibility for, say, an organization like the ATF, to, go all out on trying to take one guy out, if, he's going against the grain of the political system, that kind of thing. And I mean, the ATF, I mean, and other, groups have, basically, done horrible things to, various people, and, they get away with it. And so, seeing something like that, like, I mean, the way it's shown in the movie, like these, authority figures, going all out to get one guy, just for making them look like fools. I mean, it comes across as cartoonishly petty, but the more I think about it, it's not outside the realm of possibility. So it's not so much that, the government in this movie is portrayed as, say, a petty, organization. I mean, it's not so much that. I guess it's just that the way they're, portrayed as, cartoonishly inept, that's the part where I was kind of like, it started to feel ridiculous. But at the same time, not outside the realm of possibility in the sense of, just, how vindictive they would be if, say, one or just a couple of people, were, posing, as a legitimate, danger or, obstacle, to, their plans and what have you. So, yeah, I mean, it's kind of like a mixed, like a double, it's like there's like a coin, right? But there's a flip side to the coin. Like on one hand, some of the stuff, it's believable, but the way some of it's handled, though, comes across as kind of cartoonish in the movie, if that makes sense. And so when that happens, it kind of undermines the message that the movie was trying to go for, I think. But then again, there are moments, though, where that message manages to come through and actually sink into the audience. And there's an especially powerful moment where, and in fact, this is actually a scene that got me interested in the movie, but, Mitch, with some recording help from Valerie, one of the things he does one day is he takes out these newspaper clippings that he'd been collecting, just basically people who had been, forgotten and mistreated, by, their fellow man or the authorities and what have you. And, he's reading off, some very sad stories. And I don't know if these stories were real or if they were just made up for the movie, but they sounded like things that, you read about happening all the time in the news. I mean, like he's reading about, he's reading aloud, mind you, but he reads, for example, about, this one guy, a former, military veteran, who ended up killing himself by, driving his car, through a department store and, crashing into a wall, right? But basically, this guy had tried to ask for help because, he kept on seeing all these, bad pictures in his head, basically stemming from his time in the war. And, apparently no one would help him. And so, he took the, that, horrible way out. And then he, amongst other things, he reads about this, senior citizen who, was an invalid, I think is what he called him. Basically a guy who was more or less incapable of taking care of himself because of, physical condition. And this guy basically froze to death in his bed because he couldn't afford to pay the electric bill. And so, the place where he lived, they just shut off his utilities, and he literally froze to death in his bed. And you're like, damn. And then, I think one of the moments that really got to me, though, was he reads this article about this little kid who was mentally challenged, and apparently, the authorities, finally, what ended up happening was they found out that his parents had been keeping him in a cage, like in a basement, and basically, feeding him with a dog bowl. and basically, neighbors had reported hearing screams from time to time, but they felt like it wasn't any of their business. And the parents, they just were ashamed of the kid, and so they just treated him like an animal. And the way Tommy Lee Jones is reading these stories, I mean, it's heartbreaking enough hearing about stuff like this. Like I said, I don't know if these stories were true or if they were just made up for the movie, just basically drawing some inspiration from real life, bad things that have happened to people. But I mean, they're hard hitting, some hard hitting, sad stories for sure. And the way Tommy Lee Jones plays it, though, it's like he's wearing these sunglasses, and so you can't see his eyes, but it's like you see his face. And at first, he starts, when he's reading, he comes across as sort of cold and has this military precision, right? But as he goes further into the stories, it's like you see his face just gradually start to break, almost like he's still got his sunglasses to where you can't see his eyes, but you see like his face, and how it's the magnitude of what he's reading is really getting to him. And at one point, it looks like he's holding back, trying his damnedest to hold back tears, right? And Helen Shaver, like, granted, a lot of the focus in the scene is on Tommy Lee Jones, but Helen Shaver, though, as she's recording all this, you can tell that it kind of gets to her too, right? But that particular scene, I thought, for me, that's the scene that made the movie worth watching, simply because, while yes, there is a priority on, say, trying to draw attention to the plight of, Vietnam veterans at this point in time, they also talk about just how, ordinary people, are, hurt or killed, in horrible ways, and they're just, trying to live their lives, and they never, they weren't famous or anything. They were just ordinary people trying to get by, and then these horrible things happen to them and stuff like this. I mean, it's heartbreaking, but it's even more so when, you have people who clearly need help, but for one reason or another, they're not getting said help. And it's even worse when, say, some of these people, they know that they need help and they're asking for help, but no one's giving it to them. And so when he's reading these stories, it's like a reminder that, you don't have to have, served in the military to have experienced stuff like this. And so that, for me, like I said, is the scene that made the movie worth watching, at least in my opinion. And there's also a nice little bit where Tangerine Dream's score kind of kicks in, and it sort of, captures, the emotion of the scene very well. And, there's a nice little bit where after he's read the story, he talks with Valerie, for a bit, and he has this moment where he just briefly, becomes human again, almost like he becomes, like, say, the person that he was, prior to, Vietnam. And he's, talking about how, he would love to just, climb over that wall right now and, get away from all this. And she's like, well, why don't you? And he says, I can't. They already know who I am. And that's where I liked, seeing how, Mitch, I mean, he's committed to his mission, but he knows that there's no going back from it. Not to the point of, say, trying to hurt or kill anyone, but just, by doing this, by setting this in motion, the authorities are going to know who he is. But at the same time, he feels like it's a mission that's worthwhile. Like, while he wishes, he could go back to probably who he used to be before, he went to Vietnam, he understands that there's no going back from that. And the best he can do is, try and, make, the public understand, hey, here's what we're going through, that kind of thing. So that scene right there, I mean, that whole scene, I thought was kind of like the heart of the movie. And so, I mean, even though the movie is flawed, you do have scenes like that make the movie worth watching. So I'm going to go ahead and give The Park Is Mine 3 out of 5 stars. This is a solid movie. I mean, it does have its flaws, but at the end of the day, though, it does, I mean, it's an entertaining movie. I mean, the action for the most part is well done. I mean, not say on par with First Blood necessarily. I mean, First Blood's a way better movie, of course. But I mean, for what the movie is, I mean, the action's well done. Tommy Lee Jones gives a very good performance. Tangerine Dream has a very good score, and Yaphet Kotto and Helen Shaver, they do good in their supporting roles. I just think that in some respects, the writing could have been better at certain points, and that would have made things a little more believable, I think. And I think it would have helped if, say, the government, I mean, while they're portrayed as evil, if they had been portrayed as, say, cartoonishly evil, I think that would have been, a better way of, making the movie succeed on a more serious level, I guess you could say. I mean, but all in all, though, it's not a bad movie. It's a solid one, and at times, the message, does shine through. And so, yeah, The Park Is Mine, 3 out of 5 stars. It's a solid movie. Okay, so the Blu-ray, Kino Lorber, I hope I'm saying that name right. They're a company that's gone out of their way to re-release movies that aren't very well known by the public outside of, say, niche crowds, and they usually do a pretty good job of, say, throwing in some extras, or maybe cleaning the movie up somewhat. So the Blu-ray itself, I mean, you watch it, and the film quality, you could definitely tell it's made in the 80s, but I mean, for the most part, it's fairly polished. I mean, that there's not like any sort of spackle or grain or anything like that. It just, I mean, it looks like it was made in the 80s because it was made in the 80s, but it's a fairly clean picture. And you also have a pretty good audio commentary track by a film historian by the name of Nathaniel Thompson, who's also a self-professed fan of the movie. But it's interesting listening to what he has to say about the movie, and there are some things that he likes about it, and then other things where he's kind of like, this is ridiculous. But overall, I mean, it's one of his sort of guilty pleasures in a way. But at the same time, I mean, some of his observations about the movie are interesting, and and some of the things he talks about, like how there have been similar things that have happened in real life, wherein either an individual or a group of individuals, has, say, done something similar to what the character of Mitch has done, and basically, like, they've tried to, they've taken like an area, they've taken over a certain area, and basically, said that, we're not coming out until such and such day, because it's like they're trying to raise awareness, by way of some form of I guess military tactics and what have you, but they're trying to make a statement, and the authorities, like, they actually would just say, okay, let them do their thing, and when that day comes, though, then we take them in, then we arrest them once they come out of whatever area it is that they've taken control over. And so it was fascinating hearing about stuff like that, from Nathaniel Thompson, like hearing about how things like this, oftentimes happen in real life, but the government's usually not as inept as they're portrayed in this movie when it comes to handling stuff like that. But it would have been interesting to hear him talk about, say, some of the instances where the government has gone out of their way to basically hurt people, that kind of thing. And so, I mean, I wish they'd gone a little more into stuff like that, because, I mean, like I said, I mean, you hear horror stories about the ATF, but then again, he's mostly, talking about the movie, but just, it's interesting getting his perspective on how some parts of the movie are ridiculous because the authorities would have handled it, in a much more efficient way, like in, say, real life or something like that. But I mean, all in all, it's a pretty good audio commentary, though. And he talks about how, amongst other things, even though the movie takes place in New York City, it's filmed in Canada. And he was pointing out how they do a pretty good job of making it look like it's in Central Park, or the bulk of the movie's in Central Park, but it's actually being filmed in Canada, though. So a little tidbit there. But you also have a couple of theatrical trailers. But so I mean, not a whole lot in terms of quantity for the special features, but considering that you got a pretty good commentary track, I mean, I'd say the quality is pretty good. But also, just a little bonus here, a lot of Blu-rays that come from Kino Lorber, like they have a reversible cover. So here's the cover that you first see on the Blu-ray, but you also have the option of using this cover. So thought that was a nice little touch there. But yeah, so that was The Park Is Mine. Once again, 3 out of 5 stars. So not a masterpiece by any means. And First Blood's definitely a better movie, which, I mean, The Park Is Mine is a ripoff for First Blood. But considering that is the case, I mean, it's a solid movie. I mean, it's entertaining. It's occasionally thought-provoking. Flawed at times, but at the end of the day, not a bad movie. So thank you very much for taking the time to check out my review. You got any questions, comments, drop a line, let me know. And if you like what you see here, please feel free to like and subscribe. So y'all take care. Good night. Bye.